afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Oh, good, I'm on. So it's really great to be here this afternoon at ACS. I'm so pleased to have been asked to moderate this panel this afternoon after what has been an extraordinary full day of stimulating conversation at the conference. I have some housekeeping, of course, for everyone. First, please turn off your cell phones. Second, or just put them on buzz or whatever. Second, we are going to do some Q&A. So if you have a question throughout the panel, just write it down on an index card. There should be index cards on your tables. And then about a half an hour before the end, we'll stop the sort of free-form dialogue and move to questions from the cards. And then it says, if you want to tweet about the session, which is something I know almost nothing about, the handle is @ACSLaw, and our hashtag is hashtag ACS16. And there's CLE. So, end of that. So, so this panel, I'm going to do a little bit about why, why we came up with this panel, what we intend to kind of be talking about. Then I'll briefly introduce the panelists. Their bios are in your materials, but I'll just sort of tell you who we've got, and then we'll just get started. So, well, maybe I'll do who we have first. That'll frame it more better. So first, here to my immediate left is Ian Haney-Lopez. He is the John H. Bolt Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Next to Ian is Baher Azmi, the Legal Director for the Center for Constitutional Rights. To his left is Ilya Somin, the Professor of Law, a Professor of Law at George Mason University School of Law. Next to Ilya is Ken Mack, the Lawrence D. Beale Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. And finally, Pam Carlin, the Kenneth and Harl Montgomery Professor of Public Interest Law, co-director of the Supreme Court Clinic at Stanford Law School, and all around awesome. So we came up with this panel trying to think about the moment that we're in our politics, in our constitutional understanding. In this political season, we've seen so much racially charged language and rhetoric that's been dominating the news cycle. And it seems to trying to understand what's happening with both the impact of that and what that has meant for our politics and for our legal system. And also we, at the same time, while looking at this kind of moment of charged political rhetoric, much of which has this kind of racial tinge to it, we were also thinking that at the same time we're seeing a number of social movements at the local level, some at the national level, that are really changing how we understand what our Constitution means, and thinking about social movements as an engine of our changing understanding of what our Constitution means for all of us. And both of these things happening at the same time, trying to make sense of the relationship between them, if there is one, and how we should be either embracing or using or trying to fight against the impact of these two kind of monumental things happening. So we're going to try and make this make sense and make this fun, and I'm going to see if I can help make that happen. And I'm going to start really with you, Ian, because you've written a book called Dog Whistle Politics, and it talks about how unpopular groups can be scapegoated to manipulate policy and politics. So I guess my question is, does dog whistling work?
I would say yes. I would say Donald Trump, I guess. So I'll actually come back to Donald Trump. I think if there's a debate about Donald Trump, the debate is he dog whistling, or is he, I guess the new metaphor would be blowing a trumpet? As is passed to, thank you, very generous crowd, very generous.
No, that was a good one. I like that.
So is it just blatant racism at this point? I'm actually going to argue that no, it's not blatant racism. It's still dog whistling, and it's very important that it's still dog whistling. But that, I want to come back to that because I think there's a lot of groundwork that we need to set in order to understand the relationship between social movements, dog whistling, and where we are today. So let me start at the very broadest level. Starting in the 1960s, or 1950s, 1960s, with the sort of civil rights movement, the broad civil rights movement, that was the period in which the United States as a society really began the transition away from white supremacy. The Civil War was not a transition away from white supremacy. That was a transition away from slavery. The transition away from white supremacy really begins with the civil rights movement. We make remarkable progress embodied in the person of Barack Obama, but in many ways, the very social movement that leads against that and to other changes in terms of gender and sexual orientation, the place of religion in American life, these other changes engender the possibility of a backlash. But backlash is one thing. Calculated efforts to take advantage of backlash to transfer political and economic power is another. And that's dog whistle politics. And so let me tell you a story to try and exemplify how this worked. Think about Ronald Reagan. You know that Ronald Reagan would talk about welfare queens. There's another story he liked to tell. He'd like to look out at his audiences, and he'd say to his audiences, I understand your frustration when you're waiting in line to buy a hamburger and some young fella ahead of you is buying a T-bone steak with food stamps. Right? Now, some young fellow, the first time he told that story in the South, he didn't say some young fellow, he said some young buck. And a young buck, this sort of Southern language for a strong black man, one resistant to white authority. It was too racially egregious. And so he backed off, and he said, some young fellow. And yet this worked as a dog whistle, because people could understand, even if some young fellow on its surface was silent about race, the narrative was a highly racially coded one. It said, who are blacks? They're not just lazy. They're strong. They could work. They'd prefer not to. In fact, they're larcenists. They'd rather rip off the system than do an honest day's work. And if it's a story about blacks, it was also implicitly a story about whites. He was also saying to his audience, and his audiences were overwhelmingly white, he was saying to his audiences, understand who you are. You're decent. You're hardworking. You play by the rules. And because you do so, you're struggling to make ends meet. Meanwhile, these lazy, larcenous, no good, undeserving people are living high off the hog because they're ripping us off. Right? And this was the racial narrative that he's telling. That's the first part of dog whistle politics, the part that mobilizes people's racial anxieties, stirs them to vote. But it's not the most important part. In this story of lazy blacks ripping off the system, who is the biggest enemy of white folks? It's not blacks. It's government. It's government, because ostensibly it's government that is reaching its hands into the pocket of hardworking whites and taking their tax dollars and showering it on these undeserving minorities. Supposedly it's government which refuses to control these out of control, these dangerous minorities through lax enforcement of criminal law or through lax enforcement of the border. And if government is the problem, Reagan says, then three things quickly follow. One, starve government. Cut taxes, though those tax cuts end up being for the rich. The Reagan tax cuts in the 1980s transferred $1 trillion of wealth to the top 1% and have done so every decade since. And if government is a problem, then cut those social welfare programs that are just wasteful spending on undeserving minorities. Though, of course, the Reagan tax cuts didn't just cut wasteful programs, they cut all sorts of programs that built routes of upward mobility while at the same time increasing the size of government through corporate giveaways. And if government is the problem, then get government out of the way of regulating the true engines of progress in America, the corporations, the marketplace. And what we have is not deregulation, but re-regulation, where corporations are allowed to write the rules of the marketplace in a way that has transferred wealth and power to them and away from the rest of us. And this is the core of dog whistle politics. Not simply the use of race to mobilize voters, but the use of race to get people to commit to an anti-government, pro-market view of society that has had the effect of transferring power and wealth to the already extremely wealthy. And so when we come to this moment, when we come to the Trump moment, when you have a billionaire who's running around saying, build a wall to keep out Mexicans, ban all Muslims, vote for me, a billionaire, and his only real domestic policy proposal so far, cut taxes for the very rich by 1/3. That's dog whistle politics. And I want to just, I'm going to hammer on this one last point because it's so important for progressive audiences. Most progressive audiences, when they hear a conversation about race, default to a position in which they say, okay, I'm listening to a conversation about how bad things are for communities of color. And they are. They're bad, and they're bad because of dog whistle politics, mass incarceration, mass deportation, disinvestment in our public schools, disinvestment in our cities. But that is not what I'm getting at. What I'm saying is, if you're a progressive and you want to understand why you can't get anything done, you can't get anything done because we're in the midst of a 50-year war that has been using race to convince people that government is the enemy. And just about everything progressives want to do depends on having government on the side of the people and not in the pocket of corporations. Well, government's in the pocket of corporations because people have been fooled through a racial politics, through politics about gender and abortion, about sexual orientation, about bathrooms. That's what's driving people to support a politics that transfers power to the rich and powerful. And that's dog whistle politics, not just whipping up people in terms of scapegoating, but building popular support for an anti-statist, pro-market, neoliberal politics.
Well, what's interesting to me, we can applaud Ian. Yeah, let's applaud you. One of the things that's very interesting to me to hear you tell the story about Reagan and his coded language when he was running for president is it actually gives me this sick feeling because it's happening still right now. The sickness that I feel is that we haven't made much progress on this because this kind of still seems to be working in a way, but it just seems to still be working, and it's not. I don't feel like I've gotten to we fully understand what our counter to that, and we can talk more about what our counter is. But I want to get to you, Baher, to get you into this because your expertise, a lot of it, I mean, you do a lot of things, but a lot of it is on racial profiling and the role of implicit bias and discrimination in that with a particular interest or focus on the Muslim, Asian, South Asian, Sikh communities, Arab Muslims. How do you see this, what Ian just talked about, playing out in your communities or in the work that you're doing?
Thanks. I'd actually like to talk about the way in which sort of dog whistle politics has been incorporated in state practice, state law enforcement practice, particularly in the post 9/11 era, where the whistling the dog has whistled a particular national security tune. And it has a certain tactical feature, which is profiling. It has a certain undemocratic value that propels the profiling. And I think, if there's time, I can talk about the kind of movement strategies activists and lawyers have used to combat it. Let me talk about how this is manifested in 4 areas that I've worked on anyway. And you can see some interesting similarities. The first is immediately following 9/11, pursuant to the FBI's Pent bombing investigation, thousands of Muslim, Arab, South Asian individuals were rounded up and dragnet sweeps based on very thin pretextual tips from anonymous citizens, and where anyone was had a civil immigration violation, was automatically detained in administrative segregation and brutal conditions of confinement in New York, and subject to what we allege was a high-level policy by Ashcroft of Mueller to hold until cleared. That is, they would be held under in administrative detention for civil immigration violations until the government disproved that they were terrorists, flipping the presumption of innocence. A second area is in Guantanamo itself, where we know that hundreds of individuals were rounded up in Afghanistan and Pakistan and other remote parts of the world based on, again, very thin evidence or bounties. And brought to Guantanamo, held incommunicado, and denied the most elementary human rights, and subject to a sort of deliberate Bush administration policy of, I think, security theater with all of the iconography of terrorism that goes with it. These are the worst of the worst, hardened terrorists, but showing them shackled and prostrate to demonstrate that this is under control, sort of something that was ultimately a myth about their dangerousness that was ultimately exploded. And even once they were granted substantive rights under the Boumediene decision in 2008, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals has ensured that they can still be held on the thinnest guilt by association evidence, and the government's evidence gets this presumption of regularity, so that in fact they are not entitled to any substantive rights. Another area we've litigated is in the area of stop and frisk, which Terry stops have always, since the 1960s, been a legitimate feature of U.S. municipal law enforcement, but exploded after 2002 because of a sort of both a strategic reason and a political reason. Strategically, consistent with the sort of Ashcroft's "we will prevent crime from happening" rather than responding to crime after it happens, this became a feature of preventative policing. And Ray Kelly himself said the goal of stop and frisk is to instill fear in Black and Latino boys that they can be stopped at any time by the police. It also had a political dimension, which is post-2002, the police accountability movement died, post-9/11, that is, and the police had largely free reign, such that stop and frisks went from something like 150,000 in 2002 to a peak of 700,000. And what the trial proved is that it was premised on both pressure to stop in a pre-crime way from high up, and subject to an explicit profile: male, Black, 14 to 21. And then you have another municipal law enforcement manifestation of that, which is the suspicionless surveillance of Muslims in the tri-state area by the NYPD, a very ambitious program, again suspicionless, to sort of monitor and control the Muslim community, premised on a sort of debunked but then adopted theory by the NYPD that they need to identify individuals who are radicalized, where radicalization happens under their crockpot theory, where one is young, male, and Muslim. So male, Black, 14 to 21, young, male, Muslim, this profile emerges, and under this paradigm, basically status is a crime. Muslim immigrant civil immigration violation, an Arab in a guest house in Kabul without knowledge of intent of any connection to terrorism, a Black youth in a housing project in New Jersey, Muslim in a synagogue. So that's the tactic, and fundamentally I think it's driven by this perspective that these individuals who are threats are not entitled to a really basic element of citizenship, which is an sort of entitlement to due process and being judged through individual criteria. These are undifferentiated individuals. Male, Black, 14 to 21 is a threat, and a young male Muslim is dangerous, and it permits the government to project this kind of group association and deny them individual identification, individual rights. And the strategies in response to these tactics have been from organizers and lawyers to sort of push back on that narrative and surface individual stories.
Right. No, I think it's important because the role that rhetoric played. I mean, we all were here. We're all here for the post 9/11 rhetoric. Right. That was, I think, the foundational sort of thing that was permeating people's consciousness that allowed them to sort of have this wholesale status sense of a whole community.
Right. Yeah, there's
that
sort of
allowed that to happen.
Sure. There's a sort of a war abroad, and there's a fifth column amongst us.
Exactly. And I think it's that stuff.
Right, and there's a sort of political prize that comes from demonstrating that there is a threat and that you are robustly responding to it.
And that for whatever reason, that facts don't, and you kind of were mentioning, is that facts don't seem to matter. Right. That the narrative can be so powerful that facts don't matter. You can say as many times as you want the voices of, and it's interesting psychologically, because people believe what they want to believe on some level, or they buy into a narrative. Right. And then nothing you say can counter that. You can talk about Timothy McVeigh till you're blue in the face, but that doesn't seem to counter, domestic terrorist, or the
social cognition theory tells us that profiling presumptions are deeply embedded, and so to toss that out, maps really well with our neurological processes, our cognitive processes, and it takes a lot of work to undo that.
And then it's easy to ping it.
Sure.
it's easy to trigger. It's like the grocery store. It's easy. The grocery store story is not itself the problem. It's the story that's pinging something that's an already sort of underlying embedded narrative, and it's hard to go against that. I want to get Ken. I want to bring you into the conversation a little bit because I know that you have a lot of expertise in looking at sort of the history of the civil rights movement, the history of that as a social movement, and in looking at social movements and how they are sometimes able to kind of try to push back against these narratives and rhetorical narratives about communities, about African Americans and others. Do you want to give us a sense of some examples of social movements that have expanded our sort of understanding of who has rights and whose rights matter?
Yeah, the one that's of course on everybody's mind is the most famous one, we will call it a social movement that led to Brown versus Board of Education. And I call it a social movement because, constitutional change now is sort of regarded as something that's doesn't emanate from, the enlightenment of Supreme Court justices. It emanates from ordinary understandings of Americans that change, ordinary understandings of Americans about the Constitution that changed. And a bunch of civil rights advocates got out there in the early 20th century and they changed ordinary Americans' understandings about the Constitution. What did they have to change? Well, they had to change the assumptions that undergird Plessy versus Ferguson, and there were a couple of assumptions and a series of cases that led up to that. One is that the 14th Amendment did very little to the federal structure of American government. The 14th Amendment empowered the federal government to do very little to uphold the rights of African Americans in the South. And there was a second, and I'd call it a constitutional understanding, because you can find it written, for instance, in the majority opinion in Plessy versus Ferguson, which is that segregation was benign. Segregation was not subordination. It was not something for Northern whites to be particularly concerned about. It was something that the rest of America could leave to white Southerners to take care of. And the NAACP and other organizations organized in the early 20th century. Lawyers began to plan cases, and in this room I don't have to tell you that narrative. Most people in this room know this narrative. Lawyers began to plan cases. Organizers outside of the NAACP began to organize African Americans in the South around the country, people like A. Philip Randolph, Ella Baker. Ordinary black Southerners complained that they brought their cases to the justice system. And by the time we got to Brown versus Board of Education, one of the things my colleague Morton Horowitz is writing a book about the Warren Court, and one of the things he's found is that by the time we got to Brown, the wrongness of segregation was an easy conclusion for the justices to decide at Brown. By that time, it would have been very, very hard for them to say the kinds of things that you could find in the majority opinion in Plessy. And the real struggle they had was over whether or not they could actually write a decision that could actually be enforced in the South. So there was a social movement behind Brown. There was a social movement that involved ordinary people. It involved lawyers. It involved reimagining the understanding of the Constitution. And that's how constitutional change happens. You could do basically the same thing with gay and lesbian marriage. In the 1990s, there were a bunch of people, lawyers, activists, who began to understand that this was something to take on. It was a very tricky thing to take on. It was a very risky thing to take on. A bunch of people have written about it. But again, people planned out a litigation campaign. There were people who came to lawyers with their cases and said, my partner has died. I can't get benefits. I can't share in the things that we have built together. And over time, the lawyers and other people, they kind of planned out the cases one by one. They thought about it, but they had to change social understandings of the Constitution. And that social understanding they had to change was that, in fact, there was a constitutional right to marry. That's what the Supreme Court had decided in Loving versus Virginia. But there was a constitutional right to marry that could not be deprived based on race. And they had to expand that to gays and lesbians. And what they did is they created a narrative. And there's a famous interview, there's an interview where Evan Wolfson, who's one of the leaders of the fight for gay marriage, gave an interview and he said, well, okay, we're going to get gay marriage when some registrar who's supposed to accept marriage licenses is sitting at the counter and we have a gay or lesbian couple or a gay or lesbian family sitting across the counter from this person, and the person's thinking, wow, they're no different than the people who we're allowing to marry. So in fact, I think you could call it a social movement. They changed the understanding of the Constitution, and they did it by mobilizing a particular image of what gay and lesbian marriage was and who the people were who wanted to marry. And in fact, that's what changed the Constitution. Now, we're at this moment where we're kind of thinking, okay, do we have these other social movements out there? Where are they going? I would say, okay, one that's on the minds of everybody is the Tea Party. I think Tea Party is a social movement. It's been around for 5 years. It's changed the basic structure of the Republican Party from the ground up. Social movements, they organize, they change constitutional understandings, and they do it over time. They're able to sustain narratives over time that change understandings of the Constitution. And of course, the one narrative that they were able to sustain was a narrative in which it connects to what Ian was saying about government overreaching. What was the Affordable Care Act? It was government overreaching. It was forcing us to eat broccoli. And in fact, when those challenges to the Affordable Care Act began, they were regarded as frivolous. My colleague Charles Freed, who was Ronald Reagan's Solicitor General, said that this is frivolous. But by the time we got to the Supreme Court, we had 4, actually maybe even 5, depending on how you count it, votes actually in favor of that narrative. In fact, what did the statute do? It was an example of government overreach. So, I'd say the Tea Party is a social movement. It has been successful in embedding its understanding of the Constitution in constitutional law. And it's a movement to be contended with. Is Donald Trump representing something like that? I don't think so yet, but the possibilities are certainly out there. I'd say Trump, for the moment, seems more like the forces of reaction. But the forces of reaction can become social movements. And I'll end on one thing. Ian and I were talking about this before the panel. Of course, the antidote to forces of reaction is a social movement. So it seems to me that one of the things we need to be doing at the moment, people who are horrified by the developments in this particular political season, is to think about what is our social movement? What understandings of the Constitution undergird that social movement? And how do we begin to build up the intellectual capital, the social capital, the organizational structures to place those constitutional understandings to make them appeal to a larger fabric of the American public. So that's our work.
Absolutely. I would say absolutely, Ken. And I know ACS is very focused on that very question of, and has been for a while, trying to figure out, make sure that we have a clear understanding of what we think the Constitution means, but don't just stop there. Then think about how can we partner and be part of social movements around the country to socialize those notions and get folks to see them as not as a way of understanding the Constitution that is equally valid. And I think my favorite example of this is actually not the Tea Party, but the gun rights movement. Because really how we understand the Second Amendment today is so foreign to how it was understood just a generation ago or less. But people who are growing up now and learning about the Second Amendment, they think, well, of course we have an individual right to bear arms.
An argument Justice Berger called in 1990 a fraud on the American people.
A fraud in 1990, and now we have people and not even just at the court has sanctioned this, but people around the country believe it to be true. So it isn't just that the court has gotten this, but it's that the general understanding of our system is that. And there are other examples of that around other issues. I want to bring you into this to add to what's already been said, but also I know that you know a lot about sort of the dialogue between the Supreme Court and the people. I think you've thought about this issue, about the relationship and the dialogue that they have between that dialogue. What can you help us understand about how the court responds to or doesn't to what it perceives to be common understandings in social movements or in the society at large?
Well, the justices obviously are people of their time, whatever that time may be. And so I thought, some of the stuff that Ken has pointed to and that you pointed to, Julie, about gun rights kind of gets at this general point. The court itself has to come to understand the Constitution in the context of the times in which the justices live. And so, for example, when Justice Scalia at the oral arguments in the first round of marriage equality cases said, well, when did the Constitution decide that the restriction of marriage to opposite-sex couples was unconstitutional? Was it in 1791? Was it in 1868? The answer to that, of course, is nobody would have brought the cases then because that wasn't the way people thought at that point. That a thought has to become a possible thought in a movement before it can become a possible thought to lawyers and then to courts. I wanted to go back, though, a little and really dive into this point that I think has joined a lot of the discussion so far, and that is a point about empathy. One of the truest statements I think the Supreme Court ever made about equal protection was a statement that Justice Scalia made in his separate opinion in the Cruzan case, which was a case about the right to die. And he said, the Equal Protection Clause is our salvation because it requires us to accept for ourselves and our loved ones what we do to others. And that point, I think, has been so central to the development of social movements in the United States, the ability to build common ground and to make people see that they are like other people. And so I wanted to go back to a particular week in April of 1938. All of you in the room, I think, know about footnote 4 in Caroline Products, right? Because you focused on the importance of moving filled milk across state lines. We've kind of moved from filled milk, which was Caroline Products, to skim milk, which was Justice Ginsburg's notable statement about marriage restrictions. But in the same week that the Supreme Court decided the Caroline Products case, President Roosevelt gave a very famous speech to the Daughters of the American Revolution. And he said something during that speech that I think about again and again and again because he was such a great communicator, even before the great communicator Ronald Reagan. And what he said to the Daughters of the American Revolution is, remember always that all of us, and you and I especially, are descended from immigrants and revolutionists. All of us are descended from immigrants, whether those immigrants came to the country voluntarily or under compulsion. And the more that people understand that, the less likely they are to see immigrants as something different from themselves. And that's a critical point to keep in mind, because that's how the gay rights movement built itself up. I was at the Supreme Court clerking the year of Bowers against Hardwick, and when the justices all went into the back room to talk about the case, and there are only the 9 of them in there, Justice Powell, who was the swing vote, said he didn't think he'd ever met a gay person. And so he just thought gay people were different. They weren't like him and his family and the like. And of course, he had a gay clerk that term. He'd had other gay clerks in the past. He knew lots of gay people, but they were to quote Donald Rumsfeld, they were the unknown unknowns. And what happened in the time between then and the Supreme Court's decision in Lawrence, and then its decision in Windsor, and then its decision in Obergefell, is that gay people came out of the closet. And they turned out to be the justices' children, and the justices' friends, and the justices' neighbors, and the like. And it becomes much harder to deny people the rights you're giving to yourself when you think of them as being like you in powerful ways. And it's the difficulty in some cases of making that sort of connection that allows the law to exclude some groups of people.
Right. No, that seems so right. It seems related to what Bahar you were talking about, and what everyone here has talked about. Because part of the problem with that I've always seen with the struggle for African American civil rights and other groups is that otherness is so reinforced and so constant. Do you know what I mean? Like, no one's going to wake up tomorrow and have a black child if they didn't have one yesterday. Do you know what I mean? Or discover their child is actually black. Like, it's not going to happen. All right, stop. No, but except for a couple people. But generally, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So where do you get that empathy from? Where do you get, and then the narratives cut against that, because it's the young buck with the stake, right? And that reinforces the otherness.
Well,
you see what I'm saying?
This was one of the reasons why there was such a strong commitment to integration of the schools on the parts of groups like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, because they had this motto, green follows black, black follows green, which is if you put white children into a school, their parents are going to care about the quality of that school in a way that they otherwise didn't. It's part of what's driven Marion Wright Edelman's narrative for years and years and years at the Children's Defense Fund, which is you need to care about the education of children of color because they're going to be the workforce in the United States in the 21st century and beyond. And if you want Social Security, they have to be capable of holding down good jobs and generating good incomes to pay the Social Security taxes that are going to keep you from eating dog food as an old person.
Right.
There's your dog whistle for you.
But it cuts. I think that's right, but it's sort of 3 steps for people. Do you know what I mean? They have to make all 3 of those steps, and that can be very hard. I want to bring you, Ilya, into the conversation here, too, because a lot of what you have written about is this notion of political ignorance. And how does that fit into what we've been talking about with either dog whistling and social movements, and how that could drive people in their thinking about understanding of the Constitution?
So it fits in several ways. First, obviously, as I discussed in much more detail in my book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, there is an enormous amount of political ignorance out there, both now and for as long as we've had public opinion polling. Much of the public doesn't know very basic things, such as, for instance, in the 2014 election, the main stake was who was going to control Congress. Only about 38% of the public knew who controlled the House or the Senate right before the elections. Even that very basic thing wasn't known. And there are many other examples like this. How does this relate to the issue of tolerance and inclusion and social movements? Well, one big way it does is that if you don't know much about government policy, if you don't know basic economics, and a lot of data suggests most voters are not very strong in those points, it's very easy and very intuitive to imagine the world as a zero-sum game. That, as Donald Trump says, we have to be winners, otherwise these other people, the foreigners or other people, will beat us and we'll be losers, right? That's a part of his rhetoric. And when you imagine the world as a zero-sum game in that way, that does not, I think, lead to small government politics. It leads to the politics of we want our side to be in control of the government so we can beat up the other side and make sure that we're the winners. If you look at Donald Trump's program, that's exactly what it looks like. Trade restrictions, building walls to keep out immigrants, building a wall around entitlement programs, not cutting them even slightly, because in his view, those programs benefit his constituency, the white middle class and poor, and a long list of other similar things. His platform actually looks very much like George Wallace's platform from the 1960s, which was also based on the idea of a zero-sum game between whites and other groups, but also a very large role for government in many different ways. This issue and this kind of rhetoric is not actually limited to one side of the political spectrum. You can see it even in a person who's usually seen as very different from Trump. Bernie Sanders, if you look at Sanders' trade policy and even his rhetoric about trade, it's very similar to Trump's. We need to keep out those foreign goods, otherwise the jobs of American workers will be lost to the foreigners. Until very recently, he even had very much the same position on immigration as Trump. He has said that free migration is a plot by the Koch brothers and other evil billionaires to get cheap labor into the United States to keep down wages for American labor, and so forth. So the rhetoric of the zero-sum game, and it gets very much out there on both right and left. And for many people, if you think the world is a zero-sum game and some people have to be winners, other people have to be losers, it's natural to think, well, we're going to unite around ethnic or racial or religious lines. That's a sort of natural kind of affinity that many people feel very strongly about.
Why is it natural?
I think it's natural for a couple of reasons. One is that we feel greater empathy with people who have similar cultures and backgrounds to our own. That's not true for everybody, but it's a tendency. Second, of course, there's an artificial component as well, and that is since the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, governments and other social forces have indoctrinated people in the idea of ethnic and nationalistic affinity. There's a long history behind this, some of which I discuss a little bit in my book. I don't have probably the time to fully cover it now. So there's both a sort of natural instinct of us against them, which social psychologists find may even have a genetic basis, but governments have built on that over time to accentuate that. Finally, given that this dynamic of ignorance exists, and also that it's not easy to overcome because it's rooted in rational behavior by individuals, if your only reason to be well-informed about politics is to make a good choice at the ballot box, that's not much of an incentive at all because the chance that your vote will make a difference is extremely small. So it's not that good information isn't out there, it's that most people, quite understandably, prefer to spend their time on other things given the low probability their vote will make a difference. Given that this kind of ignorance is out there, it's hard to combat. We want to think perhaps, do we want to concentrate such enormous power in the hands of government, including in the hands of the presidency as currently exists? I'll end on this one point. I believe last week, Eric Posner of the U of Chicago Law School, a person who I don't agree with very much otherwise, but he wrote a very interesting column in the New York Times talking about could Donald Trump actually do the things that he wants to do just using the powers of the presidency as they're currently understood by the courts and federal agencies and the like. And on most of these things, Posner's answer was yes, he could do them because the power of the modern presidency is so great. Now, Posner himself, I think, thinks this is just fine. He's a big champion of extremely broad executive power. I think it's not fine. I think that we should have a presidency and also a Congress whose powers are sufficiently limited that if a dangerous demagogue takes power, as will happen periodically, that their powers will be constrained.
Shouldn't we just stop the demagogue? It kind of just reminds me of this whole thing that you hear sometimes in political rhetoric like, well, it's okay that Donald Trump may be a little bit sort of wacky and crazy and racist because the rest of the government will keep him in check. Like, really?
Yeah. So
so that's an argument to elect the crazy guy?
Yeah. So I'm all
because
in favor
Mitch
of
McConnell's
stopping the
protect
demagogue. If I could wave a magic wand and stop him, I would. However, we live in a real-world political system where there are phenomena such as voter ignorance, and where also something as very much possible as a downturn in the economy this summer could bring the demagogue to power. Or an indictment of Hillary Clinton, or other things we can easily imagine. And even if it doesn't happen this year, in 2020, 2024, we face similar dangers.
I mean, it's very interesting, the notion of political ignorance. I do think it is an interesting idea, but somehow I feel like at least what we've been seeing a lot of this season, I want other folks to sort of chime in here too, is something that isn't hard to understand. Do you know what I mean? Like when Donald Trump says he wants to ban all Muslims from the country. I mean, that's not like I don't think you have to sort of. It's not a sophisticated presentation. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I agree. It's
not even like so. You can be completely. You can be ignorant on most things, but you get what that is, and that is sort of an overt sort of us versus them.
Yeah,
And Ilya, then I'll get to you, Bahar, on this.
The ignorance is not knowing that that's what he proposes. The ignorance is knowing there's reasons why that's not only unjust, but also likely to be counterproductive in the war on terror.
That's
and
kind of
that's what most
meant.
of his supporters who support this do not understand, that by keeping out all Muslims, we are, for example, doing exactly what ISIS wants us to do. If you look at the leaders of ISIS, they say, we don't want Muslims to migrate to the West. Why? Because they might be infected by Western liberal values if that happens.
Right.
And so people are ignorant about that, even if they're not ignorant about the fact that this is what Trump proposes.
No, what I meant is that it's kind of obvious that what he's proposing is unjust. Bahar, did you want to weigh in on
I just think what's interesting, I mean, so there are various strains of Islamophobia for years, and I think the predominant form by like Daniel Pipes and Newt Gingrich and Fox News at least has a kind of theoretical cast to it. I think in America you can't rarely can you overtly discriminate, because you have to sort of hew to the American creed of equality and liberty. So the way traditional Islamophobists operate is to argue that Islam actually is a threat to American constitutional values. You know, the sort of exaggerated Sharia law is coming, and so in order to preserve the American creed, we must exclude. And as, you know, bizarrely and fantastically made up as that factual premise is, at least has a kind of some connection to constitutionalism. Trump's rhetoric is just sort of reactionary. Mexicans are coming, I will stop them. Muslims attack, I will exclude them. It's purely reflexive, and I think driven by sort of Ian's notion of not particularly any theory about this group, but a theory that government isn't protecting you. The elites are PC, the elites are weak. It's a sort of purely demagogic instinct. I am here to protect you because this government is not strong enough. They don't have the will.
Right. And there is, that's very, it's very kind of frightening. Pam?
Just jump in. I think this is a point at which what you're saying, Bahar, intersects with where Ian began our conversation, which is we have to recognize that for many people in America today, something is true that was not really true for that group at times in the past, which is people are not doing better than their parents did. And part of the reason they're not doing better than their parents did is a kind of job that enabled people who didn't have lots of education to move into the middle class isn't there anymore. And they're afraid. And you know, the recent reports about the death rate, the life expectancy rates going down and the death rates going up for white men without college educations in their middle ages is not a fiction. And so people feel that something has gone wrong, and they're looking for somebody to tell them how it can be made better. And the problem for liberals, I think, in part is that we have answers, but they're complicated answers. And this is where Ilya's point comes in. Our answers are complicated. We can't say, oh, do this and everything is solved. Donald Trump comes in and says, do this and everything is solved. And for people who are looking for solutions, it's a very tempting argument to make.
Right.
So I would say the problem for liberals is not that our answers are complicated, it's that that we have been silent on the main dynamics, right? So I think that as early as 1970, in fact, in the same year that Republicans realized they could use race to break the New Deal coalition of the white working class, African Americans, and Northeastern liberals, Democrats realized the same thing too. Except that Democrats made the fateful decision that since this was analytically, they thought, just backlash, they would themselves back away from race, stop talking about it, withdraw from supporting African American communities, and let it all blow over. And when that didn't work, Democrats made an even worse decision. They made the Bill Clinton decision that they themselves would pursue racialized dog whistling. So Clinton campaigns in '92 as a new Democrat, saying that he promises to end welfare as a way of life, promising to crack down on crime, ramping up on the war on crime, and also describing the federal government as the main enemy of the people. That is all of the conservative themes. So what has happened with liberals is, at the same time that this culture war politics has demonized people of color, women, sexual orientation minorities, and government, Democrats have largely stayed silent or talked only in terms of policies. And if you talk only in terms of policies to people who are driven by status anxieties, you will find that people aren't all that receptive because you're not addressing their main concerns. Right? I do think that liberals can respond forcefully, and I actually think, as scary as Donald Trump is, Trump presents us with the best opportunity in 50 years to reclaim a narrative, a very simple narrative that says, we best succeed when we includes all of us, every one of us, of every color, and of every background. It's a very, very simple message which has the added virtue of being right. Right? And I think that if we say to people, race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, guns, it's all been divide and conquer politics. We repudiate that politics and we demand that the government and that the market work for all of us. That's a very simple message that can resonate. And then we know what that translates into as policy. We do have a simple message. But that depends upon progressives being willing to center identity issues like race, like gender, like sexual orientation, rather than trying to continually push those to the back burner as if the only thing that unifies us is a concern with economics.
Well, I think that's very, I want to ask you, Ken, picking up on what Ian just said, because you've looked at these different social movements over time. Do you think what Ian says would work?
I think there's two ways of reading longer-term trends in American history. There's one in which something like Ian says will work. There's another in which racial division, and I'm going to say race is something different than ethnicity, that racial division has been the one constant in American politics since its founding. You know, it's really, really hard to do that. I mean, as Pam was saying that, I think that the marriage equality movement worked because of empathy. I mean, it was that quote from Evan Wolfson, it was sort of getting people who had never sort of thought about this to think that gays and lesbians who want to get married are just like me. And that empathy has always been very hard across racial lines.
Yes.
It is very hard work to do it. I think it's necessary work. I mean, I think Ian is exactly right in our ultimate objective. I mean, we are in the midst of a massive demographic transition in American society. People talk about the coming of a majority people of color society, new groups of immigrants. Are Muslims really part of the United States? These are questions that we're going to grapple with for the next 30 years. And even though it's clear what the ultimate direction is going to be, how we get there can be really, really ugly. I do think that there is a danger of demagoguery in the next 20 years, massive danger of demagoguery. And I think we do need to grapple with Ian's question. And I'd like to be optimistic that Americans can think beyond racial divisions, although I am not always so optimistic.
Well, yeah, no, I feel the same way. I'd like to be optimistic. I'm not sure that I am. And I think part of what the barrier, one of the other elements of the barrier there, at least from my perspective, is when you're a community that's under siege all the time, and every time you're putting yourself into this sort of larger community, you feel like you're getting kind of a little bit beaten up. Sometimes the thing you really want to do is just retreat. You want to say, you know what, I'm done with this integration BS. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to retreat to my more segregated world, honestly, because it's just easier for me right now, and I sort of feel more comfortable, and I'm sick of having to talk about explain to people about, my racial group or sort of my religious group. And I think there can be an instinct of retreat that also makes this hard. It's not just demagoguery that I worry about. It's what I see as divisions, even stronger divisions than when I was coming up. When I was growing up in the 70s, it was like the rainbow hands, right? All remember the rainbow hands? Yeah. Like everywhere you see the rainbow hands. You don't see the rainbow hands anymore. And I just wonder if, go ahead, Ian.
So I completely agree with the point about empathy. I think empathy is incredibly important. I do believe that a lot of these ideologies, these are all social constructions, right? The race, the gender, sexual orientation, these are all social constructions. Yeah. They're founded upon the idea of fundamental difference that can be used to justify mistreatment, dehumanization, brutalization. Okay, so I really think the antidote to that is empathy, but I want to add another factor, and that is power. How have these social constructions been used in a way to actually distribute power in our society? And that's what I think is making some of them much more difficult to break down than others. So if you think about sexual orientation was demonized, was degraded, but was not a basis for distributing power. Whereas gender has been much more a way for distributing power, and race even more so. And so as we try and build empathy, it's not just how do we make human connections? It's how do we think about the role of these different axes of division in structuring our society, in implicating power? Because we're trying to make human connections across not just individuals, but across the distribution of power in society in a way that demands or doesn't demand fundamental structural change in society. And I think when we think about what's happened with race, it's easy to think, well, race is a way in which power was distributed for several centuries, and now we're dealing with the vestiges. But in fact, when you look at dogmas of politics over the last 50 years, or you look at it now in 2016, you understand race is how we continue to distribute power today. Racism is very much in the material interests of significant segments of the American population, or at least significant segments of the population think it's in their material interests. And this is what is part of the big challenge. Empathy is the key. But we have to understand that we're trying to build that empathy in a context that is deeply implicated the way in which power is distributed in America.
Yulia?
So a couple points on this issue of empathy, and also on the broader question of building racial and ethnic tolerance and other things of this sort, goals which I absolutely, definitely share. On the first point about empathy, I think it's actually dangerous both in the judicial arena and perhaps in some others to say what we want is a politics of greater empathy, because for most people, most of the time, it is much easier to feel empathy for those who are like ourselves in various ways, racially, ethnically, sexual orientation, ideologically, almost any other social division. It's easier to empathize with those who are more like you than with those who are less. So if we want an inclusive politics and ultimately an inclusive political system where there isn't oppression and injustice across these kind of lines, what I think we want to do is get people to think less in terms of empathy and more in terms of logic and reason, because logic and reason can get you to see that this person who is different from you in various ways is also entitled to basic human rights, is entitled to freedom, is entitled to non-discrimination, and so forth. Or, as Federalist 1 says, ideally, and the founders fell short of this ideal themselves, but ideally we want a government based on reflection and choice rather than a government based on emotional, empathetic identification. Secondly, on this question of building racial and ethnic and other kinds of tolerance, I think we have made a lot of progress in that direction, though uneven and with periodic backsliding. I do think that if we ultimately want to achieve the goal of building tolerance in these areas and of eliminating division and zero-sum politics, then we want to think about whether we want to build up identity politics ourselves. Look, we're in my corner of the world, in the academic world, what we see is things like safe spaces, speech codes, intolerance of opposing speakers and the like, often based on ethnic identity politics. And when people outside academia see this, many of them who are not on the left or even hostile to it, they say, well, if these guys have their identity politics, why shouldn't we have ours, right? This is an explicit part of the rhetoric of many of Trump's supporters. So I think at least as a political matter, if we want to build up tolerance and if we want to eliminate the sense that there's a zero-sum game between different racial and ethnic groups, then we ultimately want to foster a politics of downplaying racial and other types of forms of identity, just as in a historical analogy, a century ago, it made a huge difference in America whether, for instance, you were a white Anglo-Saxon or whether you were an Italian-American or an Irish-American or whatnot. And what ultimately overcame that, I think, was a de-emphasis on those particular lines of division rather than a sense of, well, we have Irish identity politics and that will ultimately overcome the prejudice of the white Anglo-Saxons and others. I'm not saying we can be completely oblivious to race and ethnicity. It would be silly to say that we can, but I do think both on the right and on the left, because you in this room have some responsibility here as well, we achieve more by emphasizing logic and reason and by trying to downplay identity politics rather than by trying to foster it.
So, Pam, do you have any sort of reaction to what Ilya just said about the logical versus empathy? What he sort of said.
I don't think of I think of empathy as being soft-hearted, not soft-headed. That is, it's a way of getting people to understand the point that Ilya is making as a point of logic. I think is also one ultimately in the political system of one of feeling, that you have to feel that people are human beings. You can't argue somebody who doesn't believe that Muslims can be good Americans. You can't argue that person into that position without them having some feeling that it doesn't matter what your religion is or it doesn't matter what your race is to whether you can be a contributing, productive member of our society and whether we have a responsibility to take care of you as a member of our society. And so I think, heads without hearts or hearts without heads are both equally unlikely to be successful political movements. That's why you need both. So to go back to something you were saying very early on about the gun debate, it wasn't just that people started to feel differently about this, it was also that there was a scholarly movement that gave an apparatus to the courts. And one of the things that a lot of people have said about how you think about when courts write opinions, they have two things. They have reasons and they have justifications. And the reasons are the things that are really driving them, and the justifications are their explanations for what they're doing. And you have to provide courts with justifications as well as creating social movements that give them reasons. And so I think those two things kind of work hand in hand. I don't think they can be kind of hermetically sealed off one from the other.
No, that totally makes sense. I want to do a little bit more in thinking about when we're talking about social movements, and I want to ask you again, Ken, because when we're looking at the social movements that you've looked at historically, where have we seen like unintended consequences? Have we seen social movements that we think are going this way, then go somewhere else? Or should we be worried about the movement having an unintended consequence for the Constitution? Or do we...
Well, there's a big debate in the scholarship about unintended consequences of movements. I mean, the standard narrative is that what we lawyers do, is we take kind of broad social movements and we sort of narrow them because we have to narrow them into legal questions that we can get political actors or judicial actors to respond to. So that is, I always say to my students, that is what we do. That is what lawyers do. There's a big debate about that. The big example, of course, is Brown versus Board of Education. Everybody who's read it understands that the Supreme Court doesn't offer a very satisfying rationale for why segregation is unconstitutional. They sort of begin to offer some sort of hints in the subsequent cases after Brown, but we kind of never got a real explanation for why this thing was unconstitutional. The justices had reasons, and they offered justifications, but justifications weren't, particularly compelling. Of course, in the 1970s, there's been a lot of recent scholarship of this, how the conservative legal movement begins to sort of pick up on this and begins to reverse the whole thing, and to make the problem that the 14th Amendment is responding to is the problem of quote-unquote racial classifications. And racial classifications of any kind are equally objectionable. And I know Ian has a wonderful article where he sort of takes Justice Thomas to task for sort of saying that affirmative action is just like Jim Crow. Well, why so? These two things are completely different. I mean, one could be for or against affirmative action, but it is not just like Jim Crow. But in fact, the social movement that produced Brown, did produce an interpretation of the 14th Amendment, which did what they wanted it to do, but there were consequences of both the inability of the social movement lawyers and actors and of the Supreme Court justices to define exactly why the 14th Amendment prohibited school segregation, and we live with some of those consequences. Lawyers make arguments are malleable, they are manipulable, they are flippable, and that is just another thing that comes with the territory of what we do.
Behar? Oh, I'm sorry, Pam?
No, go ahead.
Please, on that point.
I was going to say another example of this that you see playing out in contemporary law is the question about how the gay rights movement made its decision to go after don't ask, don't tell and marriage as the two kind of wedges for legal action in the Supreme Court. Because, of course, if you read Justice Kennedy's opinion, it talks about how important marriage is and how fundamental marriage is. And what does that do, of course, to people who choose not to get married? I mean, there's this point where he talks about if you don't get married, you're going to be like crying off into loneliness for the rest of your life. And, for some people, saying that marriage has to be the basis of a full and meaningful life tells people who don't believe in marriage or who don't want to get married that they're somehow less human in a way than people for whom this is their fundamental urge. And so you can often have that kind of argument, or the argument that was made after Brown that one of the problems that happened was the destruction of part of the black middle class who had institutional roles in the predominantly black schools. And when integration came, for a bunch of reasons that are really quite inexcusable, those teachers and those administrators were shunted aside. And so there's often this question of, as you build a movement and as you move forward, how do you capture some of the things that are sort of collateral to the thing you're most concentrated on doing?
Right. Bahar, and then I'll get to you, Ian.
Okay, I might just add another. So we've talked about how social movements have produced legal results in Brown and in the gay rights area. I might add another data point in the national security context. And David Cole has an interesting new book called Engines of Liberty, where he talks about a lot of civil society groups responded to the Bush administration's aggressive national security practices and to some extent successfully shifted the entitlement to rely on national security to do anything. And I want to focus on just one sort of small piece of the interaction between law and social movements, and think also about how lawyers can deploy social movement narratives to successful legal ends. And that's to do with Fred Korematsu, who was an individual who challenged his internment by the federal government as unconstitutional in World War II, and to the court's lasting shame, or rather I should say to the court's contemporary shame, modern shame, not contemporaneous shame. The Supreme Court upheld his detention as part of military necessity and despite due process and equal protection principles. And he and other heroic Japanese Americans started a social movement challenging the legitimacy of the internment, surfacing stories about, and the Academy did as well, the illegitimacy of the decision, the false factual premises underlying the decision, and developed this narrative that courts should be actually skeptical when the government claims unbridled authority, and courts should be skeptical of claims of military necessity. And in 2004, he files intentionally an amicus brief in the enemy combatant cases, Hamdi and Rasul, holding a mirror up to the Supreme Court and saying, do you want to do this again? And the court, for a whole number of reasons, decided it did not want to repeat the mistakes in the past. And then just sort of one additional way in which we in our work sort of deployed this narrative is we challenged the suspicionless surveillance by the NYPD in New Jersey, and the district court issued a Korematsu-esque like decision saying, well, it's not discrimination if you're trying to fight terrorism. And we appealed the Third Circuit and very intentionally tried to interject the Korematsu narrative into the court through amicus briefs by descendants of Japanese attorneys. And so there's a way in which you can challenge power, but also build power. And what we're intentionally trying to do is develop a connection between that social movement and what's happening to Muslims now. Because the Japanese Americans, with all of the moral authority that they had, was saying, this looks suspiciously like what happened to us. And linking these two social movements together builds power for Muslims. And let me just, if I may, just read how the court reacted to that deliberate sort of introduction of past mistakes. This is the conclusion of the court's decision reversing the district court. We believe that the statement of Justice Jackson in his dissent in Korematsu to be on the right side of history, and for a majority of us in quiet times it remains so until the next time there is the fear of a few who cannot be sorted out easily from the many. Even when we narrow the many to a class or a group, that narrowing, here to those affiliated with a major worldwide religion, is not near enough under our Constitution. Quote, to infer that examples of individual disloyalty prove group disloyalty and justify discriminatory action against the entire group is to deny that under our system of law, individual guilt is the sole basis for deprivation of rights, citing Murphy's dissent in Korematsu, and the court concludes, what occurs here in one guise is not new. We have been down similar roads before. Jewish Americans during the Red Scare, African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement, and Japanese Americans during World War II are examples that readily spring to mind. We are left to wonder why we cannot see with foresight what we see so clearly with hindsight, that, quote, loyalty is a matter of the heart and mind, not race, creed, or color, citing the ex parte endo.
Very powerful. So, Ian, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I actually wanted to come back and unpack the term that Ilya used of identity politics, because I think it's a very powerful term, and I want to think about it on the right and then on the left. So on the right, I think identity politics is often expressed in the language of colorblindness, that we ought not to notice race, that we ought not to talk about race, and that to notice race or to talk about race is itself a form of racism. And I just want to note the way in which that relates to dog whistle politics, because colorblindness is the formal conversation about race on the right. Never talk about it. If you talk about it, you're a racist. And then there's the informal but pervasive conversation about race on the right, which is in dog whistle terms, to talk about thugs and illegal aliens, Muslims, Mexicans, while pretending it's a national origin term rather than a racial term, right? All of those are ways to talk constantly about identity, about resentment, to stoke an idea of whites as embattled, while at the same time superficially saying, don't talk about race. And so, and you actually see Donald Trump saying this in this conversation about Judge Curiel. And here, I need to say, by the way, yes, I'm Latino, but I'm Salvadoran, not Mexican, so I'm not biased. Okay, just, I want to clarify for those of you who are worried. But you notice Trump says his critics are the racists. That's the language of colorblindness. Right. He said, all I talked about was his heritage, but you accused me of being racist, and since you accused me of being racist, you're the real racist. That's colorblindness. What about identity politics on the left? Identity politics on the left has adopted a form of colorblindness. It's called post-racialism. Post-racialism doesn't claim that talking about race is racist. It says talking about race is counterproductive. It's divisive. We shouldn't do it. It leads to balkanization. And I can't think about a more dramatic misapprehension about how race actually works. We are not divided because there are people of color who insist on talking about race and that has led to balkanization. We are divided by a long history of a country structured and organized in terms of white supremacy. And so when you turn to a conversation about race, for example, the Black Civil Rights Movement is first and foremost a conversation about race. That is a conversation in which a degraded group is organizing around their identity, not abstractly, but in order to counteract that very degradation, in order to insist upon their humanization. more generally, we need to be willing to talk about identity not in the free to be you and me sense, but in the equality sense. Talking about identity in terms of unjust social hierarchies which profoundly structure our society. That can be race, it can be gender, it can be sexual orientation. More and more today, it's class. But we cannot, as progressives, achieve an equitable, inclusive society unless we have forthright conversations about unjust social hierarchies and how they're actually operating in our society.
That's I'll applaud that one. 1 second, Elia. So there are ACS people walking around to collect questions. If you have questions, please just hand it to someone. And then we'll do a couple more up here, and then we'll take the questions from the audience. Okay, I'm sorry, Ilya, go ahead.
So just briefly, I think the point that claiming that I don't want to talk about race or that people in general don't want to talk about is a little bit of a straw man. I am not saying, nor very many other, if any, serious thinkers saying that we shouldn't talk about race. Rather, what we're saying is that it's not a good idea to organize ourselves around identity politics and treat the world as a zero-sum game between different racial and ethnic groups, as certainly Donald Trump and many of his supporters are doing, but as you also see with elements on the left, particularly on college campuses and elsewhere, where they have a very broad definition of what they consider to be racial and ethnic prejudice, which leads to things like safe zones, speech codes, trigger warnings, other things of this sort, which not only chill free speech, which is bad in of itself, but also alienate a vast range of people who don't already support this particular cause. So I think when you look historically about how progress has been made towards greater racial tolerance, it usually has not been by emphasizing the importance of classing people and dividing them based on their racial and ethnic identities. It is not my claim at all that no group should ever organize around the fact that they've been oppressed. Obviously, they sometimes should, but that organization should be done as much as possible in terms of broader, universal, rational principles rather than in terms of, it's sort of us against them, and we have to have our safe zone, and we're going to be angry about microaggressions and trigger warnings and the rest of it. So I think that's the point. One also small point about social movements and the courts, what we were talking about earlier. I think obviously social movements influence the courts, and we can't eliminate that influence. Probably we shouldn't want to completely do so. But given the range of social movements out there, and given also the influence of prejudice, political ignorance, and other factors, I think we should be wary of encouraging a situation where what we say is what we want the courts to do is just to follow trends in social movements. Throughout the period that we've had survey data for, one of the strongest findings is that racial, ethnic, and religious tolerance tends to be correlated with education, with political knowledge, and things of this sort. So it may be desirable to have a court system where, at least to a large extent, the judges are at least partly insulated from trends in public opinion and in social movements. That actually, in some past crises, has served us well, or at least better than we would have been served otherwise. The Guantanamo case is mentioned earlier, an example. If the court had simply followed dominant majority opinion or dominant social movements, they might well have ruled very differently in those cases. And the same thing is true in a number of other episodes in history.
Pam?
I just think it's important to remember that there are two kinds of cases that the Supreme Court, for example, decides. It decides constitutional cases, and it decides statutory cases. And one of the things to keep in mind is social movements produce statutes, and the court ought to be enforcing those statutes according to the way the social movement got that statute enacted. So social movements of the Second Reconstruction are much more important to the integration of racial minorities into American society and civic life than the Supreme Court's decision in Brown standing alone. We didn't get the desegregation we got because of Brown. We got it because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the threat of funds cutoffs to schools that didn't desegregate. We didn't get integration of public spaces because the Supreme Court started enforcing the 14th Amendment. We got it because of the Public Accommodation Statute and Title VII and the decision of a social movement that disparate impact and not just disparate treatment was problematic. And so, it's one thing to say the courts should be independent in their understandings of the Constitution. realistically, they're never going to be independent of the times they grew up in, because that's going to tell them what they think is cruel and unusual punishment. Absolutely. That's going to tell them what they think is due process, or what is equal protection, or what is a reasonable or an unreasonable search or seizure. But when it comes to statutes, I think social movements are entitled to the victories they gain. If they get a statute that's not unconstitutional, courts ought to enforce that statute and not look for ways to peel that statute back to the most parsimonious or the narrowest possible reading.
Right. Behar?
That's something, I fully agree, and that's why obviously Shelby County is a sort of a travesty of a decision. But I'm also concerned about Ilya's suggestion about not resorting to identity politics. And I know that word is a bit loaded, and we can accept that as a loaded term. But if we unpack it, I'm worried about what that means, for example, for the Black Lives Matter movement, which avowedly is anti-accommodationist because of the ways in which the promise of the Second Reconstruction has not been fully realized, and that policing is still wildly disproportionate in these communities. And the goal of the movement is not, as the movement leader confronted Hillary Clinton, about passing additional legislation, but very much about challenging white identity and the privilege that comes with it, which has perpetuated this kind of deeply systemic repression of black communities. And I think the urgency of that demand trumps, to use a word, sort of civil discourse or a resort to kind of rational accommodation.
Right. Yes,
I actually
Ilya.
think this is an excellent example of the very point that I was making. I actually agree with many of the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think there is a dangerous militarization of police. I think the police do engage in racial and ethnic profiling in many instances, not always because the police themselves are racist, but because it may be, in their minds, a kind of rational stereotyping. But I think by casting this primarily in racial terms, which is understandable that they did, the movement has actually missed an opportunity to be more successful than they have been in terms of gaining change, in that if they had focused on these broader concerns of excessive police power, militarization, and, by the way, over-criminalization of many aspects of society, they could have built on the support that you saw in the aftermath of Ferguson, for example, both on the left but also on the right side of the political spectrum, where lots of people, including people like Rand Paul, for example, GOP senator, spoke up against this. By focusing primarily on the racial angle, I think they've actually limited the size of the coalition that they could have otherwise generated. So I think it is understandable that the racial angle be a part of it, but I think they would have done better to focus less on that and more on the broader issue of over-criminalization, police brutality, militarized police tactics, and the like. I think more could have been achieved. I remain hopeful that maybe more will be achieved over time. But this is an example of where a movement getting caught up in identity politics actually limited the scope of its appeal.
I mean, look, I don't want to get too caught up in all this, but look, racism is at the heart of the problem. See, that's the problem. The problem is that racism itself is the problem. So if you want to fix racism, then you have to deal and talk about race and talk about it in racial terms. And, and if you don't want to do that, then you're missing the point. And yes, we have a problem with overcriminalization, but that overcriminalization is rooted in large part in racism and these ideas that black lives don't matter. And they certainly don't matter as much. And this comes back to empathy. Because the reason why, part of why racism is flourishing is because of this lack of empathy. And as Ken was talking about, how hard it is for white America to have real empathy with black America. It's just still too hard. And that is the problem, more than just the police are out of control. Yeah, they're out of control and they're killing black people much more than they're killing white people. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I agree. I would just take that another step. The violence against blacks from the police, that's not new. And so to say, well, we could have solved that if we'd talked more abstractly, no, we didn't. We ignored it until the Black Lives Movement put it in our faces and says, we're going to stop you from shopping in your shopping malls, we're going to block traffic, we're going to protest, whereupon people are like, oh yeah, there's violence, but if only you'd talked to us nicely, we would have done something about it earlier. That's just not reality. But I want to be very clear. I think we actually miss something if we describe that just as racism. The violence, the police violence in black communities is dog whistle politics. It is 50 years of politicians scaring the bejesus out of white voters by telling them, dangerous black people are going to get you. You got to support me in the thin blue line between us and savagery. And if that's what the politicians are telling voters, that's what they got to do. Republican and Democrats. They've got to amp up the level of funding, the level of prisons, the level of violence that is not just tolerated but expected from the police force. It is dog whistle politics which has generated so much violence by police forces against communities of color. And now when we say, well, what's the solution? Part of it is empathy. Part of it is saying to whites, imagine what it would mean if when your children left to go to junior prom, you really were sick in the pit of your stomach that they wouldn't come home that night because they ran into a police officer. Exactly. Right? And part of it is saying that to white folks, but here's the other part, saying to white folks, hey, empathy's good, this stuff is immoral, but let me tell you something else. The way we've allowed the police and our society to demonize black folks has actually convinced a lot of whites to hand power to the corporations. And if you're worried about your children, you know they're going to come home, but what's their future? Are they going to have a good job? Will they have a pension? Will they be able to afford a home? Will they have a lifestyle like yours? And if you're worried that they won't have a lifestyle like yours, it's because racial fear has led so many whites to hand over power to the corporations and the super rich, right? So that we can talk not only in terms of empathy, but in terms of self-interest. To say to whites, and this is something that is dramatically different in 2016 than it was in 1964, to say to whites, listen, in 1964 you could say to whites, racism is a great moral evil. And some few whites would hear that, but many of them would rest contented that racism, however wrong, was not bad for them. In 2016, this is the time when in the United States we can say to whites, racism is a great moral evil and it's destroying the future for your children. End racism to save your own children.
So I want to get to some questions and throw them out for folks on the panel, just so we can make sure lots of other people's voices are heard in this conversation. So the first question I have here is, how can Muslims and non-Muslims hinder or combat this current ideological war that is going on now? And I think it is probably the war against people who are perceived to be Muslim in America. So how are we going to end the ideological war? I don't know if we can answer that one. Anybody want that one? Bahar, you want that one?
Answer.
Okay,
no,
good.
I don't have the answer.
Oh, no, shoot.
I think in the same way that other persecuted groups have combated repression, which is through political organizing, strategic litigation, and a smart combination of the two. I think that's been hard in the Muslim community because for the sort of recent immigrant Muslim community, there is a fear of the police. That is, the surveillance has had the very effect it intended, which is to chill their political activism and their courage. And the community either sort of, geographically and politically is not as unified as it could be, but I think that's changing, particularly with the second generation, the sort of newer generation. And there's a sort of an increasing outgrowth of civil society, Muslim-specific civil society groups who are in fact organizing. But there's still, and there's a sort of tension in the Muslim community about sort of cooperation with law enforcement
Right.
and being accommodationist versus really kind of resisting the potential for co-option. And that's like any movement has a fissure and is going to have to take time to work out. But I think there's some promising steps about sort of organized political movement, particularly among Muslim youth.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things we have to try and keep doing what we know works well better, and more of it, and hope that we can seize on moments to make a little bit of a bigger leap than we could have before. And what moments do we have?
It's going to be hard to lose our Muslim president, though.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. That was good. Okay, so this question is essentially, why have courts given up on school integration? That's the question, essentially. That the courts have a lot of power, they're not using it. Why have they given up? Ken, you perked up. Why have they given up?
I think American society has given up on integration. Was this question school integration?
Yeah, it had to do with schools, yeah.
Oh, yeah. American society has given up on school integration. I'm not sure if it was ever committed to it. I think, this is probably the toughest front of the integration battle. Actually, no, the toughest front of the integration battle is housing. But housing and schools are, of course, closely correlated. But lots of people have begun to explore sort of the civil rights movement in the North and kind of what happens when you try to integrate schools in, I don't know, New Rochelle, New York, and places like that. And everyone knows what happened in Boston. I think that I think there was an expectation, there is an expectation on behalf of many whites that to go to school with black children is to go to an inferior school, to live in a neighborhood with lots of black people. I mean, you can live in a neighborhood with a few black people, but live in a neighborhood with lots of black people is to experience a decline in your material circumstances. I mean, this is not something I'm invented. This is kind of Stanley Greenberg, the pollster who wrote sort of Middle Class Dreams, sort of discovered this when he surveyed suburban whites in Michigan in the middle of the 1980s. There was a fear of living and and our children going to school with black people as a motor that would cause a decline in our status. I don't think Americans have been committed to it, but there's a political explanation as well. I think that this was part of the dog whistle politics going from the 1970s forward. School integration was used as a club. Exactly. It was used as a lever. And judges who were appointed, it was used as a lever for particular people to get political power. Those people appointed judges who were committed to reining school integration in, limiting it. So, I'm not sure if the society's ever been committed to it. It is the thing that caused suburban whites to react most negatively, that and housing. And I think that a lot of political hay was made out of it, and it was an organizing tool.
Right.
And those are two very prominent reasons.
Can I just add something?
Go ahead, Pam.
Which is, Ken is undoubtedly right that there are large parts of the country that were never really committed to school desegregation. But there were several parts of the United States that were deeply committed to it. Seattle, Louisville, Charlotte, Mecklenburg were all engaged in large-scale, voluntary school desegregation, and the Supreme Court shut it down. And the reason the Supreme Court shut it down is because justices were nominated and confirmed for the Supreme Court who don't really care about integration and who aren't committed to racial justice. And so it's not just that the people weren't committed in some ways. The Supreme Court told them that they were bad and evil and unconstitutional for wanting their kids to go to desegregated schools.
I'll take that as a friendly addendum.
Yeah, it is. It's not hostile.
School integration worked where communities organized locally and they committed themselves to it.
Right.
Neighborhoods, Mount Airy and Germantown in Philadelphia, neighborhoods, people worked to commit themselves to it. But it took work because you were going against the strong tendencies of American society.
Well, it does seem like from what we've been talking about that it's kind of like this kind of partnership, right? Because you can have the social movement, but if the courts then turn around and kill it, then you don't move forward. Or you can have the courts, but if the social movement is not there, then you also don't get it. You can have
all the players you want if they've got the umpires.
Well, right. Right, the umpire, well, but it is interesting that sometimes, and maybe that sometimes, I think you're absolutely right, but sometimes on the margins, the umpires see the wind and decide, you know what, if there was different wind blowing, I might go a different way. Do you not think that's right?
I think for some of them it's right. I think some of the people who shut down racial integration in the United States and would like to shut down affirmative action, they're not going to be blown by any wind because this has been their project their entire professional lives. And the only thing you can do about people like that is outweight them and defeat them.
That's right. Bahar, then I'll get you, Ilya. Go ahead.
Oh, just quickly, just to sort of tie it back to Black Lives Matter. I mean, I think to take the sort of housing segregation or clearly the sort of dog whistle analysis was this is deserved. This is proof of a self-fulfilling prophecy. These people cannot get out of their situation. But part of what's been important about the thought leadership in the Black Lives Matter movement, think about Ta-Nehisi Coates' article on reparations, is this is subject to intentional government decisions to segregate. This is not sort of a neutral happenstance. It's subject to deliberate government policy driven by racism, and that has to be surfaced.
Right, that's right. Ilya.
So 2 points on this. One is that the Supreme Court overall has done a pretty good job of ending the kind of segregation where government says the blacks must be here and the whites must be there. The kind that remains is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily tied to segregation in housing. And in the 70s, there were experiences with trying to overcome that with busing, which encountered enormous opposition, not only by many whites, but even it, in many places, divided the black community and caused a variety of problems. So if we want to overcome this today, one obvious way is to reduce the connection between where you go to school and where you go to live. According to studies by the Brookings Institution and others, when you have school choice programs, that both causes much less opposition in busing and also increases the integration of the schools. More importantly, it also improves the performance of poor minority students and others. The second point is on the housing front. That's not an easy issue to fully address, but one of the big areas where we do have at least a growing cross-ideological consensus in my field of property law is in the area of exclusionary zoning, that particularly in major cities, restrictions on new housing construction and the like due to zoning laws greatly increase the price of housing, particularly for the poor and the lower middle class, and also in many cases increase racial segregation as a result. Don't take my word for it. Read the report of this on this recently published by the chair of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. So if we can promote greater school choice and simultaneously also reduce restrictive zoning, particularly in major cities where it's especially strong, then I don't promise that then we'll get perfect school integration and all problems will be solved, but they can be reduced significantly, and that could be accomplished without the kind of painful conflict and negative side effects that you had with things like forced busing in the 60s and 70s.
So
Go ahead,
I'd like
Ian.
To comment on this. Just to say very quickly, so I haven't talked about con law at all. I'm actually a constitutional law professor. But how did I end up with this book on dog whistle politics? Well, I spent a decade trying to make sense of I guess in Pam's language, the justifications that the Supreme Court was giving for its equal protection race doctrine. And those justifications are ludicrous. They're shot through with hypocrisy and implausibility. And so then I thought, well, if it's not the justification, what is it? And that led me back to who was nominated, and then to the presidents who nominated them, and then to the politics of the presidents who nominated them. From 1970, Richard Nixon pivots, and he begins to use the courts and school integration, forced busing, as a dog whistle. And part of the way he seeks to satisfy the resentment of this increasingly conservative electorate that he's appealing to is by a war on the courts that seeks to put judges and justices on the courts who are strongly opposed to racial integration, not just indifferent to it, but they're strongly, and that's how we get here. And I have to say, so I gave this talk on constitutional law and dog whistle politics, and then a book publisher approached me and she said, I'd love to have a book on this, but the law is boring. Can you drop that part? So hence the book, but it really comes out of this. It has a real significance here. It's a mistake to think about opposition to things like school integration or support for aggressive policing as if this reflects merely vestigial racism from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. Rather, it reflects a constant reinvigoration, a constant stoking of racial fear and resentment. And the implication of this is 50 years on, we need a new social movement. We need a new social movement that recommits us to the idea that integration is the way in which we heal as a society, that we ought to get government to speak for all of us, right? That's the implication of dog whistle politics, even in the judiciary, and that recommits us to the idea, by the way, that who we elect as president matters because that has to do with who fills the next vacancy, because this is not just about which way the wind is blowing. This is what are we as a people demanding of our politicians, and what are we going to demand in terms of our courts.
That seemed like worthy of applause to me, too. So we only have a little bit of time. I'm going to ask one last question. Okay, so I got 2 minutes. So one last question. Or maybe I should not do one last question. Maybe have one last very quick thought from folks in the panel. I'll say what the question was, and maybe each of you give a quick thought on that. The question was, understanding that we were talking about how social pressure and social movements can bring about constitutional change, should we be afraid of that given that Trump could be the president? I'll start with you, Pam.
That just means we need even more in the way of social movements, not less.
I think that the social movement causing constitutional change is a fact. That fact cannot be sort of wished away. It is a fact, and I agree with Pam. The answer is to, form your own social movement and keep the other people from winning.
Yeah.
So I'm all in favor of keeping bad people from winning. However, as the Federalist paper says, enlightened statesmen and enlightened public opinion will not always be at the helm. So we want a political system and a constitutional doctrine which is to some degree at least insulated and impervious, or at least limits the impact of bad people being in power, because they will occasionally be in power, both because of political ignorance and for a wide range of other factors. And even good people, when given great power, often do very bad things. So we should think about trying to limit the kind of power so that if Trump becomes president or another bad person becomes president, as will happen sooner or later with some regularity in our history, that we can be protected against that instead of having to be at the mercy of whatever political majority might arise.
We got to keep going because we got to get out of here.
Very quickly, so Trump is not a movement. He's the counter movement. He's the reactionary. He's Father Coughlin or the Southern Manifesto, and I agree. The response has to be, and a predictable one, because in response to social change, reactionaries emerge and stoke fears. And so we have to double our efforts to build up progressive social movements in response.
Ian, last word for you.
So I love this. There are so many movements that are already out there, and I think the project is actually to begin to show the connection. And for me, the core connection is government must serve the people. But government can only serve the people when we, the people, refuse to be divided by unjust social hierarchies. And if we can take that message and link it to all these different movements, the immigration movement, Black Lives Matter, the movement for reform and political fundraising, the environmental movement, to try and link all of these movements by saying we are all committed to the proposition that government has to serve all of us and will serve all of us when we refuse, let's put it in the affirmative, when we see that we really are all in this together, everybody of every race, of every background. That's the core.
Good ending. Thank you, panel. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.